Good morning. I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. My name's Jessica Drew Johnson, and I work for Blizzard Entertainment, and I'm in the cinematics department. But within that department, I'm on a small team called in-game cinematics. Now, I wanted my talk to sort of go over what it's like to work in an industry like mine, and especially on a team like mine, where we're constantly kind of like adapting and changing our workflow to fit with what the game is offering, what technology is offering, but also trying to like develop and create new ideas and improve quality. Like we're constantly moving forward, and what it's like to work on a team like that. And then after that, I kind of wanted to give you a rundown, at least on one of my specialties, which is character topology. So a little bit of everything. But yeah, it's mostly about how to keep up and how to be extremely useful. I like to make myself a super invaluable member of a team, but it's just that, it's a team. I'm working with so many different people every single day that I also wanted to offer you a little bit of advice, like how to talk to animators and rigging guys. But let me rewind. Let me start with my education, because a lot of you guys are actually students or looking to become students or just starting out. Like, let me make this not quite as scary. Like, I'm just like you, I swear. So my education started actually not at all in the game industry. In fact, I had no idea that I would end up in games. I started at the University of California, Irvine, studying chemistry, and I had just picked up my second major in computer science when I realized I needed to pay more bills. So I just happened to be super, super lucky, and Blizzard Entertainment was on campus, actually, at my college. And they were looking to gear up for this game they hadn't even released yet. They were still finishing it, called World of Warcraft. And I ended up getting hired onto their their game master department, which is like the customer support within the game. And I got to program a couple tools and whatnot to help out with support and manage a team of people. But actually, what was the most invaluable thing about my experience working in kind of a boop, boop job in Blizzard was that I got to meet a bunch of really amazing people. It was actually talking with industry professionals that kind of like led me to understand maybe where my place was as a professional and maybe where I wanted to go. So like this weekend, definitely take advantage of talking to just everyone. You don't maybe know where you want to end up, or maybe they'll give you a better idea of where you want to go, but like it was talking with people and just doodling at my desk. The first person that came up and talked to me was Brian Morrisroe. He's one of the original artists for World of Warcraft, and he's like, you need to be an artist. And I was like, what? No one makes money as an artist. And just other countless people. I got to talk to programmers and producers and all this stuff, and I really learned. I was like, oh, actually, art is where I want to go. And I ended up talking with my friend, Adam Byrne, who's an animator. He's over at Ready at Dawn now, but at the time, he was at Blizzard animating for World of Warcraft. And I was like, where do you even go to school for this? And he's like, I mean, you know, there's like Ringling and stuff like this, but actually, you should check out Gnomon. Which is actually where I went to school. Now, I didn't know if I should have taken my art seriously. It's such a subjective subject, and I was coming from science, right? There's a right answer, there's a wrong answer, you do things, you get results, it's great. But I was like, this art, my mom says it's good, but I don't even know if I'm capable of accomplishing anything. So I took like a class. I was like, let's see what's going on. I took a figure drawing class, and my teacher was like super stoked to have me in the class. I was like, oh shit, maybe I'm okay. The guys over at Gnomon, like everything from faculty to the students, were really encouraging, but also really inspiring. So I spent 2 years at Gnomon. This is back when the program was much shorter, but also super intense. And it was just like such an amazing experience, but I kind of went in with like an open mind. I didn't know where my specialty would lie. Like, I knew that I enjoyed sculpting and I enjoyed drawing. I'd never touched computers for art. I'd never done any of this stuff, right? So I wanted to kind of keep an open mind, work on, 3D modeling and animation and rigging. Rigging definitely appealed to the programmer side of me. But I was taking all of these classes and learning so much more about the process. And Gnomon was really, really nice to me. They knew I had come from a games background, and they let me switch out classes as needed. So I got to pass up like a green screen class where I was spending roto time, and I got to take another character animation class. And I got to skip out of acting for animators and instead opt for another sculpting class. So I really got to actually tailor my education to what I felt games needed. And that's really, really fortunate. I liked that I got to take control of my education, but it also meant that I was getting like this super well-rounded education while I was there. So like, one thing I want to say is definitely keep an open mind. You might be like, I'm going to be an animator, but take a little bit of everything because there might be something that you're really needed for that you didn't think of beforehand. I really want you to keep an open mind and figure out like this path that you're going to take, where you're needed, what you might do. So like, I knew I wanted to work into games. I'm taking all these classes that are all applicable to games. So I took 3D modeling, and that was, Maya, Zbrush, hard surface, organic modeling, all of this stuff. I wanted to tailor at least one slide for folks that maybe weren't really knowledgeable about CG. So it's everything from digital sculpting from characters to environments. I spend a lot of time on that stuff. Even NURBS, which no one uses, barely, but it's math, and I like math. Rigging, the actual initial class at Gnomon taught us a ton of things, everything from the skeleton to skinning the weights to doing and building set-driven keys, which is if I bend this, then the bicep goes out a little bit. It's pretty sweet. And a lot of animation. And like one of the coolest things about taking this combination of classes is that they told me not to. They're like, don't try to animate your own characters. That's a horrible idea. And I was like, I'm going to animate my own characters. This is going to be great. I would take all of my characters that I made, and I was still learning modeling, so I was like baby modeling. I was like, yeah, it totally looks fine. Adding my own rigs, figuring out how to skin weights, and then animating my character and trying to get all of that done in time for every week's homework. Yeah. So I was animating my own stuff, but in the process of trying to animate my own characters, I would break everything. And I'd be like, okay, I have to go back to the rig, and then I have to go back to the model. And actually from this, I was learning a lot about trial and error topology. Like, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. And because I was spending all my time on topology, I ended up seeing topology everywhere. Like, for reals, I would like look at the cracks sitting outside for class, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I could just, I can quad that, and add a line there, and do this, all the time, like ceilings, quad. So I was like living and breathing topology. But the result was I became a really well-rounded 3D modeler. Because even though the classes were vastly different, they ended up all being really valuable for me as a modeler because of everything that I was learning. Gnomon was wonderful. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of stuff that I don't use. I learned a lot of stuff that I definitely use. And I learned a lot of stuff that I use to communicate with my teammates. Like, I have a basic understanding of what these guys are going through, so I can at least talk with and find out what they need from me. And at the end of it all, there was a job posting for Blizzard, and I hadn't necessarily anticipated going back there, but Alex was like, you need to apply. We're going to work on your demo reel this weekend. You have 2 days. And I was like, oh, snap. So I made a demo reel in 2 days. And one of the things that my reel was lacking was hard surface modeling. I had a lot of organic sculpts like Zbrush stuff, but I hadn't done anything specifically hard surface, which is subdivision modeling. So this gun was something that I made over the weekend and rendered. It's not textured at all. The job was just modeling. So it's just to show that I could do this sub-D sort of modeling practice. And that's really topology dependent, like how you do your edge cuts, how you do these flows, matters a ton, because once you smooth it, it all comes together. So you can see like the render with it smoothed, and then what the wireframe kind of looks like when it's not smoothed. Well, that demo reel was great because it got me my job. Hey. I actually happened to come into the industry at a really good time because they were looking for people with ZBrush knowledge, and that was definitely one of my strengths coming out of Gnomon was ZBrush. So I started in the pre-rendered side as an environment modeler, and I got to work on some really cool stuff. I kind of curated a little mini reel with some of the stuff that I worked on from 2009 until like 2010. Yeah, so I'm just going to show that now.
dreams and make believe. The face of pride we didn't know begins to show. Begins to show. It just took time to find my own. Get up and go. No point in trying to hide your demons now. Let's go!
So I did a, shit. Thanks, guys. So it was really, really wonderful working on all of those cinematics. Definitely some of my favorite art styles. Like having the opportunity to work on Diablo was like the best. Because it's not just like a tree that you're making the most gnarled and epic evil tree you've ever seen. And then all those candles, that was actually really funny because I'm a junior artist at the time. I was cleaning up UVs for senior artists. I was setting up shaders for everybody else so they didn't have to. I was learning RenderMan on the fly so I could figure out how to do stuff. It was just really wonderful because I was on a team with some of the most amazing modelers in the world. Like, I got to work really closely with Fausto De Martini, Vitaly Bulgarov, and all of these guys, and I'm helping them out. They're like, here's a pew. And I'm like, oh my God, look at this topo. What are you doing? Fausto's like, well, that's your job. But it was really, really wonderful, and I actually got the opportunity to work on a number of principal pieces, and those candles, the like jajillion candles, that was like a really nice moment for me to take a lot of my sculpting skills and make things really quickly, but also build kind of like a mini process for handling candles that were quickly approved for art direction. Art direction over on the pre-rendered side is pretty brutal. They're looking at every single detail from every single angle. They're trying to find ways to reuse assets when necessary, but they're also concentrating on even just the smallest thing, like the thickness of the wax, because of how the shading team would end up handling things later on. It was pretty critical, but it turned out that I was really good at candles. So I got the opportunity to work on a few principal pieces, but mostly I was just helping enable because we were on a team. I was a little baby junior artist. Hold on. So sorry. I was talking a lot yesterday. But I was just such a new artist that I was hungry for any opportunity that I had. And any sort of, hey, there we go, any sort of thing that I could learn from these guys and just support the team in general. But there came an opportunity to move teams, and it was over to in-game cinematics. Now, the reason I made the switch from pre-rendered, which is pretty fantastic, over to in-game was because I'd have a lot more opportunities to work on principal pieces of art. Now, I'm selfish. Like, I liked helping all these guys, but I wanted to be like, making cool stuff that's taking up the full screen. I wanted to see my pieces really, really directly. Just getting that taste of having all those candles to show off was like, oh, I want more. But also, over on in-game, I knew that maybe down the road I would get the chance to work on characters. Just so you guys know, working as a character, like finding a job as a character modeler is brutal because everybody wants to go into characters. So I knew that I had to like take my dues here and there, but you know, I had my goal, but I was like, I think this is the best path for that goal. So I moved over to the in-game cinematics team, which was at the time working on a lot of Starcraft. Now, they had just wrapped up Wings of Liberty and were starting on all of the Heart of the Swarm, the Zerg campaign. And so in-game cinematics, on average, was making about 30 minutes of cinematics per game, whereas the pre-rendered side of things was maybe making about 3 minutes of cinematics every year. It's a pretty big difference. The tools and whatnot that are used for both are vastly different, but with 30 minutes, I would have a heck of a lot more opportunities to make cool stuff, but also a bigger variety of stuff. I wouldn't be working on one set for 3 months, I would be working on one set for like 3 weeks and getting to move. And that variety is actually the spice of life. So because we ended up between Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void making about an hour of cinematics, I decided to show you a piece of art or a chunk of the cinematic that I was most proud of, because this was me and my coworker, Troy Perry, developing the Zerg homeworld. Now, not a lot of concepts existed, so we had an initial sculpt phase where we all just got to make cool Zerg trees and plant life and all this stuff. It was still environment stuff, but it was environment sculpting. I had just finished up so much hard surface like poly modeling where it was all subdivision that I was hungry to get back into Zbrush. And so this particular piece of cinematic was an example of that.
Kerrigan, I have been to the beginning. Behold, Xeras, birthplace of the Zerg. Here the Zerg evolved, and here the Dark One altered them. Those left behind are the primal Zerg. They fight. They kill. They evolve.
So you guys have never had a challenge quite like making a densely populated jungle in a game engine with poly limitations and texture limitations. Like, we had to get stupid creative with this because we needed the draw distances of the jungle to still make it feel like this really fantastic rainforest stuff. We had a limited number of models that we could insert into the game engine, so we had to build each of those models so that they looked vastly different depending on how you rotated. And then we had to support some pretty wild camera movements, like going through the fallen log as you're chasing the Zerg, like figuring out exactly what you're going to see, how you're going to see it, how much motion blur can disguise what you're going to see. And then one of the scenes that I had never gotten to actually set dress, but like set dress and model for a camera pan zoom out while still maintaining the density of the jungle. So it was getting super creative with this log swoops up and disguises that whole plane, and then this, vine hanging down here. We had to get super, super creative because we were working within limitations, but those limitations ended up giving us the opportunity to make stuff work that maybe with no limitations you would have never thought of. So we created kind of a caldera that we built the environment into, so the jungle built up behind the characters, so they kind of killed each other in a valley, and this whole beautiful thing coming up and a lot of foreground elements. I learned actually a lot about cinematography from this particular sequence because it's how the balance of plants and the flow of action. And I took a lot of classes. By the way, Blizzard offers a ton of educational classes, so I was like, give me all the classes because I know what I'm missing. And it was cinematography. But that sequence I'm really, really proud of because we did so much with so little that it was just really exciting. Now, as Starcraft and Legacy of the Void and all of this was starting to slow down, I was doing environment modeling for them, but I also got the chance to do some effects. It's kind of an all hands on deck with a small team, but also with a project like that because we all wanted to get stuff done. So I learned a ton about effects and how to make effects work in that. So I got to do lightning bolts on Kerrigan and a lot of dust and clouds and stuff. But I learned a ton about effects, but also once again about cinematography and how to make a shot look really, really excellent and intense. But while we were finishing up, I had a little bit more free time because my principal discipline wasn't being used Pre-rendered was like, hey, there's this program called Marvelous Designer. Do you want to make some costumes for us? Actually, scratch that. They had me physically bring in my sewing machine to make a costume for the director to wear so they could get all these action shots of a panda fighting. No, it was really exciting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Marvelous Designer, which is like a digital sewing program tomorrow, but I got the opportunity to work on that. It was just really, really nice, but around this time, there was another team within Blizzard Cinematics called our Machinima team. Machinima is not quite the right word for it. They were making cutscenes within World of Warcraft using just World of Warcraft. And so they merged with our team, and they're like, oh my goodness, we need a modeler. And I got to work on characters finally. So, I mean, that was pretty sweet. And you know, I had been playing World of Warcraft since I started at Blizzard way back when, and so these are the characters that I'm super into. It was like a wonderful opportunity having this World of Warcraft like cutscene team merge with my in-game Starcraft team. But cinematics, like, they evolve a lot. This team, they came to us, they merged with us because we had built a pipeline in a game. We had figured out how to make movies out of Starcraft, which is something that no one had really done prior to that. I mean, that might not be right because there's a lot of games that are making really great movies, but not so many that are making movies within the game itself as the render engine. So the Machinima joined us specifically to take advantage of the pipeline that we had built and see how we could bend that pipeline for World of Warcraft. Now, that pipeline is inherently dependent upon the game that you're making stuff in. And the World of Warcraft engine, it was never intended to make movies. Like, that's not the point. It's to play and kill dragons, and it's very exciting, but like, it wasn't made to make movies. There were no cameras. These guys were doing crazy stuff. Okay, so Machinima, what they started out with, they were using the game to make the movies. And it's not just like, oh, they used the game and they rendered in the, no. They made it with the game models, so they built a character, dressed the character, used the model, and they weren't animating. They didn't have any animators. They were chaining together emotes, like the talk emote and the sit emote, and all of these things using scripts and hotkeys to sort of make their characters perform. It was bananas. So it's like these characters are puppets that they're controlling with like well-timed key punches. And at the time, World of Warcraft didn't even have a joint in the mouth, so they had a third-party program to put like lips for the characters to talk over. But like, there are a whole bunch of like wild and crazy, like Wild West guys that are like, we're gonna get it done, we're gonna figure it out. So they're hand controlling the characters, they're like puppet, and they've got, you know, they would have a team come over from quality assurance to come and act these characters or be like the background characters. And they would have one guy with flying turned on as their camera. So they're actors, they're like, okay, go. And they'd have to have rehearsals as if it was like a play, but a play that was put on in World of Warcraft. And they've got the guy that's just like flying and invisible, and he's like, I'm the camera. It was wild. And then they used Fraps to capture this stuff. Now, I use Fraps when I'm like, oh, I want to show my cool workflow. They were using that to make movies. So it was like all hands on deck. It was 3 guys killing it. They all started out actually making movies for fun in their spare time, and Blizzard was like, oh, hey, I kind of like what you're doing over there, and they hired them on. So I'm going to kind of show you what World of Warcraft cutscenes looked like before they merged with my team, and then talk about what it meant for them to merge with us.
I will show you the justice of the grave and the true meaning of fear.
You've been at this for days, Goel.
The elements remain silent, Agra. You called, little shaman, and the Fire Lord has answered.
So they did a lot, and they understood their own creative limitations, and they tried to kind of disguise that. They're like, every character wears helmets, that's cool. And they were applying effects over afterwards, or making their own individual sprites, and then screenshot for like an explosion. They're like, screenshot, add, screenshot, add, screenshot. Add. Like, it was bananas what they were doing, but they were making real movies with no tools, which is kind of inspiring because it means that anybody could make a movie themselves with like next to no tools. Like, if your passion is directing, direct anything by any means necessary. You don't have actors, well, you have game models. Like, you don't have a camera, well, you have fraps, it's free. But the biggest changes to the World of Warcraft in-game sort of cutscenes was actually when the game engine itself got cooler. So Mists of Pandaria, I had just finished up making the costumes for that little, like, welcome to Mists of Pandaria, it's awesome, stuff for the panda and the captain. And Mists of Pandaria had a couple game engine updates, and that's when they realized, oh, hey, we need a character modeler to, like, actually get in here and do some stuff. They didn't really have a pipeline, but the engine got really cinematic, actually. With Mists of Pandaria, it had already had like water rendering and light shafts, so there was creative things that you could do. The Worgen and Goblin models were put in games, so they recognized that things could be a little bit higher res and still work. But Mists of Pandaria, the engine became beautiful. They added really dynamic light and shadow stuff, and like that might seem small, but having the ability to sculpt light and shadows is the difference between like a soap opera and a movie. So it was an amazing upgrade that we're like, oh, snap. We can use that to like actually make a movie. And then Pandarans themselves used the technology that was already in World of Warcraft on the characters, but had to actually be stripped out of the game for launch. Initially, all of the game player characters had hands and movement and facial controls, like a lot more bones in the characters than were pushed with the game. And it was a decision that they made because they're like, oh, well, yeah, one character can perform really well with all of these bones and the game will run well, but not 500 characters on the same screen with all of those bones. So it was a decision that they made to remove it way back when, but with Pandarans, they put it back in. And so suddenly we had, facial controls and hand controls with just the game models as they were, just these like little characters, and that meant that we could use animators on them. It was really, really cool to see these changes in the game. So the team itself upgraded. They're like, well, this is when they grabbed me. And they combined forces with the in-game cinematics department. It was really kind of cool because they're like, you guys figured it out. Let's see what we could do and see what we can make. Now, there was no pipeline to figure this out, so they needed to grab Chris Evans, who was, at the time, a rigging and tech artist for the in-game cinematics for Starcraft. But he also understood so much about programming and the pipeline that we had built around Starcraft that he could use his brain and make World of Warcraft actually function, like importing in animation, exporting renders, and all of this. So he developed kind of like a WoW pipeline. We had Hunter Grant heading up animation, and so he's like, yeah, I can make some cool stuff with these pandas. And then myself and my friend Zach Podratz, we went over on the modeling side of things. Now, initially, the engine, the pipeline, and all that stuff was a baby. There wasn't a whole lot that even that pipeline could support from us. So we were mostly just kind of like increasing the fidelity of characters for screen. So it was everything from making them look a little bit less polygonal and reworking the textures so that they held up for like extreme close-ups, so that it enabled our animators and our director to sort of capture what he was looking for. So Mists of Pandaria was bare bones team, bare bones pipeline, but it was the first time we were actually acting with the characters as keyframe animation, and the characters themselves had been changed from their game model form into maybe something a little bit fancier. So I'm going to show you a little bit from the Mists of Pandaria era.
Bring it to the pools. Enough! You have run rampant for far too long, Hellscream. The world will hear of it. I answer
Mists of Pandaria, the modeling challenges for me, it was taking like a character and making sort of a principal actor. Now, the workflow that I did was also inherently tied to what our technology and what our team could do. So it was mostly just making these one-off models for like Thrall or for Gromash, who I think that orc guy was, and kind of making them an actor, a principal character. And it was really interesting because, well, I hadn't worked on characters and I had an idea of how to work on characters, and this wasn't that. This was like wildly different, and it was like make it work really quickly, and make it work as best as possible. So it was a lot of like, what do you need? Okay, this is what I think it needs, and so I would try things. And the director, who had never had a modeler under him, was just like, yeah, it looks great, let's go and do the thing, and it's orcs and it's angry. It was a lot of stuff, and after we had finished a number of cinematics for the Mists of Pandaria stuff, well, I had some downtime, and I'm like, well, you know what we can do? We have all the player characters, which are pretty rad, and so I sort of reworked all of them in my downtime. I went through human male, human female, night elf male, night elf female, goblin, like I just reworked all of the characters, because I didn't know what we were going to use in the future, but I knew I wanted to try. And I kind of made like this cast of what I called the generic characters, and these were characters that we could use in our cinematics as kind of like a starting point, but also they could be used for the cutscene, the machinima stuff, where you would chain together scripts. We still used that for our background characters, because we had one animator, we had one character modeler, we didn't have a lot of resources, so we wanted to like keep everything within the pipeline really agile. So we were still using our script guy to like act out all the crowds, yeah, orc. So they could still use the armor sets. They could still just like build up and wear whatever was in World of Warcraft, these characters could wear. So we had a great costuming department. They still used the game rig and they still used game animations, but I could then take those and we could use an actual animator on them. So we had these moments behind the scenes and then these key moments of principal animation. And I use the word principal and then like background a lot, yeah. But while we were working on all of the stuff for Mists of Pandaria and I was working on my generic cast, PR was like, actually, we really like what you're doing. Do you want to make like some goofy stuff with us so that we can sell this, that, or the other thing? And there were a lot of like boost your character up to a certain level. And it's not a movie. It's not like this is the lore and the serious character and a quest, but it was rather like we just get to do something fun. And my team, specifically my director, Taryn Gregory, and my animator, Hunter Grant, love Looney Tunes. Like I mean, who doesn't, right? But I mean, they super love it. They're like, I can't wait, it's gonna be amazing. So the ideas that they were pitching to PR were just these like really exciting little vignettes of a silly goblin and a silly gnome doing stupid stuff together. So we had done a boost to 90 around this time, but I'm gonna show you the one of those that I really prefer, which is the boost to 100 that came with Legion. And it's like this goblin who's trying to figure out how to catch up to the gnome, and so he's making a bunch of inventions, and that doesn't, well. So it was just like this really fun opportunity, but it was a moment that we were able to take our pipeline and push it even further. Like, we didn't just, here's the pipeline and it's never gonna change, but rather we worked on and improved every single aspect of everything that we could every single time we made a movie. It was that like fluid sort of improvement that had leaps and bounds and jumps every single project that we took on. So the really fun projects, we learned a bunch and then brought it back into our movies. And the movies then we took in and did, yeah, it's a really fast-paced pipeline. Stuff changes all the time. So with Warlords of Draenor, the World of Warcraft engine updated again. And the coolest upgrade ever was the thing that helped me out the most, and that's when they updated the player character models. And they didn't just update it like geometry, textures, like they went through an art overhaul and made these things like super, super, super amazing. And so all the player characters got an upgrade, and because the player characters were getting that upgrade, the rig and technology within the game itself got an upgrade. So suddenly it went from this number of bones is the top limit to this number of bones is the top limit. And the technology supporting our characters, and therefore the technology supporting our movies, had the biggest jump yet. And character models. Like, look at that. It goes from 2004 to, what was this, 2012? Like, that's a vast upgrade. And suddenly my job was way easier. So I didn't have to do all of that myself and get it approved by the World of Warcraft team art director every single time. Suddenly I had like a really great solid starting point, and that meant I could actually push my characters even further because I was spending so much time making stuff look proper on screen but still true to the World of Warcraft style that it was like I could get one character done in maybe a week, but this made it so that I could make a character and upgrade it and do all fancy stuff in like 3 days. Warlords of Draenor are also got some like anti-aliasing tech, and if you're not really familiar with renderers, that's kind of what makes a renderer. RenderMan, how it interpolates the edge of a character and it renders it different from the background, that like technology is what is the proprietary part of RenderMan, that like edge. So how you render your edges is your renderer. And the World of Warcraft engine suddenly was like a renderer and behaving like one. So they did all this anti-aliasing tech. So our stuff looked even more cinematic coming out of the game engine. And because the game engine was getting cooler and suddenly there's so many more bones and the character models can have like way higher poly counts, we actually got a dedicated rigging artist, and we stole him from pre-rendered rigging. We're like, hey, we're really cool over here, but also really, really awesome team to be on because we were working on so much more content than anybody else that he would have the opportunity to work on countless more characters while everybody else that he left behind were working on like a character for X amount of months. We got a lighting and compositing artist. Now this is like the person who's taking the final renders out of World of Warcraft and putting it together and making it truly cinematic with tone, mood, settings, and stuff like that. And we got an effects artist, which was really, really great because we'd been using like the effects system within World of Warcraft to kind of like push our stuff, but it was so much better when we actually had like a dedicated artist who lived and breathed and put tutorials on the internet about effects. So, and then we got more animators because you definitely always need more animators. We were making so much content that like Hunter was stealing people from pre-rendered all the time, so we ended up with like a dedicated IGC animation team. So Warlords of Draenor it was like right when we felt like a little mini movie studio within the movie studio within Blizzard Entertainment. And we made some really cool stuff, but it wasn't just that, like, oh, we have all this technology, but like we actually got creative control to tell really impactful stories with unique characters, with unique experiences within the world. And I mean, if you work in movies, hopefully that's kind of what you're chasing is like, I want to tell cool stories. I want to be a part of a team that's making stuff that people care about, or at least care enough to watch or interested in. Like if you read books on the weekend, it's the same sort of thing. It's like, I want to get lost in a world, in a lore, all of this. So Warlords of Draenor was amazing.
And all that stand against us will die.
Storm the portal!
Rise up, Iron Horde. Bring your war chief. Perhaps this was not our destiny. You will all die.
Just you.
You must answer for your crimes, Garrosh. All I did for the Horde! You chose your own destiny. How dare you show your face here, Gul'dan? Your men have died for nothing. There is only one choice. I will build a Forge an unstoppable weapon. They will defy you. Gul'dan failed. Jenna is free!
You don't think it's over?
I fear this is only beginning.
So, like, Warlords of Draenor was a really big deal for our team, not just because of like how the game engine pushed us to do cooler things, but it was the first time that the World of Warcraft team and the creative minds behind World of Warcraft really trusted us. Every game team, it's like, we own our property, you're playing on our worlds, but we're gonna like watch you and make sure that you're doing everything that we want. And it was the first time, because we'd already kind of like worked so hard and so frequently on this property that they knew that we understand and cared about the world as much as they did. So they let us create crazy stories, like tearful moments, like epic conflict and all of this stuff. And it was really, really empowering because, like, at least for me, I actually started to get artistic autonomy. Like, I got to make choices and show it to the art director over on the World of Warcraft team, and he like immediately liked it. By the way, that was really rare. That doesn't happen, and I think it was because like I was a long-time WoW player and a super geek that I was like, oh my god, elves! That they were like, yeah, you totally got this style. Go, keep on. And they let us create. No, I'll get to that. Hold on. So the modeling focus for the Warlords of Draenor was to give our animators the ability to make those stories. At least that's how I perceived it. I was like, oh, wow, we're doing so much. And I mean, what can I do? How can I help? What do we need? And it really came down to all these conversations with Hunter of like, oh my God, we're gonna make this really cool moment, but orcs, they have these faces. How do I make them sad or angry? Like, how do I evoke that performance out of them? And I'm like, well, what can I do to make that? And so I really studied how my choices with topology would enable the animators to give really impactful and emotional performances. Yeah, they are these cartoon, like low poly in the whole scheme of cinematic and VFX sort of things. They're these low poly characters, but like, how can I make them resonate? And it's through animation. I also had to really learn a lot about the nuts and bolts inside the World of Warcraft engine. Like, well, what can the engine do? What are the limits that it has? And I had my rigging team. I was like, okay, be real with me. Like, what are we working with? Is this working? Is this too much? Is this too little? Because like, I could easily take a character with armor on and then model out all of that armor as individual plates with the character underneath. That way you could get slide of armor over stuff and all that. I'm like, is that too much? Is that too little? Is it making more work for you, or is it working? And they were always really real with me. They were very, very happy to share, like, this is really cool. These are the moments where you want to pull the armor off the character and make it like a separate thing because it'll look really rad. But like, especially in the torso, you kind of want to keep it all together because the game engine itself had a limited number of bones that could control a limited number of vertices. Each vertice could only have an influence from 4 different bones, which became especially complicated in the face. The face has so many subtle, wonderful movements, and we wanted to give our animation team like that control over the face to like really get every single little thing, because the difference between like, sadness and shame could just be like one little noodle on an eyebrow. So I wanted to be able to give them that, but within the limitations of our game engine. Now, while I'm doing that and trying to figure out how to make them work, I'm also being selfish in myself. I'm like, I want stuff to look rad. And I was trying to make artistic calls because I was the only one there to make those calls, because my director was still like, I have this idea. And my tech team is like, you have these limitations. And my animators were like, fuck yeah, let's do it. Sorry. So I was like, I want to make every character amazing. So I was like, just super stoked. So I'm reworking like the overall fidelity of the silhouette. You know, the difference between a game character and like a pre-rendered character would probably be silhouette fidelity. And by giving your character layers, you give it the implied complexity that maybe a game character straight out of World of Warcraft wouldn't have. And it was that complexity that I was chasing because I wanted our stuff to like hold up as this like movie within the universe that looks like it belongs in the universe, but looks like the idealized fantasy of the concept art. Because man, that concept art is motivating. Like, I love that stuff. And so I'm working like the silhouette. I'm spending a lot of time on that. So I'm like actually changing the silhouette, which previous iterations of our cinematics, like they were like, no, don't go too far. And I'm like, you won't know that I went far. And then I'm reworking textures, and that's a constant because sometimes we're dressing up our characters in super old armor sets that are coming into me at like 256 by 256 textures, and I'm like, oh snap, I gotta make this 4K. But that was actually a really cool opportunity because I had like this loose sketch of what stuff was gonna look like, and I gotta make it super high res and make all these decisions, but I gotta make those decisions. That's why I moved onto this team, because I got to be in creative control, and if I did it right, no one noticed. No, I mean, like the art director was like, oh yeah, that rings true. So he didn't realize how much work that I had done. Like if I had put it side by side comparison, he'd be like, oh my God. But like I gotta figure out, oh, how does that armor go on the character? Where are the straps? What's the back look like? Because sometimes that was missing. And you know, our animation would be like, wah! And you get all this showing up on camera, and I'm like, that makes sense. Like Velen was a really cool character. The game model himself is like a head, and his body is his beard, and then he's got legs. So he's like head, beard, legs. And I'm like, and they're like, yeah, we want his beard to be separate. And I'm like, what's this? And but that's actually really cool. Like I enjoy those moments. And when I do it right, the art director is just whoosh. They're like, yeah, it looks cool, approved. And I'm like, yeah. By the way, the approval process when you're working is bananas. It's always hard. Like, you can't please everyone. You can't always communicate these ideas. So if you can get it right without them even having to, like, explain what they're chasing or explain more than once what they're chasing, like, power to you. But you gotta, like, it's a lot of work. So it was like, I always wanted to make it look like these characters were coming straight out of the game, but with a fidelity that the game, just because it's a game, you have, 500 characters on screen, you got your whole raid and a huge boss. Like, you can't have that in a game and have the game run. But we wanted to make it look like the best version of the game and true to it. So, yeah, it was, like, really cool to have that artistic control. And it was in Warlords of Draenor, in the first actual couple cinematics, that they gave us the first character that didn't exist. And this is, like, a debate, and it's not a debate anymore. It was a debate for this one character, and it was Yrel. Now, Yrel is this Draenei, awesome paladin of justice that she and her model don't exist in game. There's no real part of her that comes out of World of Warcraft, and like it was this strange debate. Like we made horns that were unique to her because of the concept art. Man, our concept artists, they're so stellar. And her concept art, that one little piece for Yrel, was why we made a whole series of cinematics. Like, it was just one piece of art, and my director was like, oh, this character, we're gonna do such cool stuff with her, and she's gonna save the day. Like, she was an amazing character. And she was the first time we were doing a cinematic character that didn't exist in game. And beyond that, it was a cinematic character that they ended up liking so much in the cinematics that they put her in game, which is also really satisfying for me, because I'm like, look at my stuff, it's in game now. So I got to work in games without working in games. Yeah, I was happy. So, clicky, clicky. Ha. So Yrel was kind of like Warlords of Draenor I'm talking about. It's like this emotional performance. I'm a little bit embarrassed of this topology. This was when we were still figuring shit out, so ignore her. But it was the first time our animators were making these characters feel, And Yrel was like this really, really cool moment. Now, her face is wild, like tiny little nose, itty bitty lips, huge dang eyes. And animation was like, how do we even handle those eyes? And I'm like, they have to be almond shaped. They have to be exactly like this Draenei thing. They're anime characters. And they're like, oh my gosh, our rigging team was like, ah, like the whole time, trying to make this stuff happen and happen well while still being true to this concept art. And like, you can still see that it's still low poly. We still had like a ton of limitations, but in the end cinematic, like, she looked amazing and was like, her journey as a hero from a little baby Draenei to taking over Velen's charge, if you follow World of Warcraft at all. All right, she becomes like super empowered by the end of it, and all of the cinematics that you take part in as a player character, you're doing these quests and working alongside these heroes, and she eventually comes into her own and super saves the day. She's amazing, and she was wonderful to work on. Like, a lot of choices went into her, not just for her horns and stuff, but also to rework her armor so that it made sense. All armor in World of Warcraft is just kind of a texture over a standard player body, and this time we wanted to make like her chest plate come out and prop out, and it's like vastly different than what you can do in game, but because we're in this cinematic little pocket bubble world, we got to do that stuff, and it was really exciting for me. So I love Urel and what she meant for me creatively and what she led into for Legion. All right, so now we're kind of like up to date, right? If you play World of Warcraft, Legion is amazing. Legion, like, what changed with the engine? Well, draw distance upgrades. Now, you're like, draw distance, that's so, compared to like character upgrades, because character upgrades was the best. But draw distance was just like another aspect in the game of making it a mini movie studio. Like, this is what you normally see in game, and suddenly you could see so much further. So pretend you're establishing a shot in some epic location, like having just like a silhouette blocking out in the background is like, oh, okay, that's one thing. But then having it trail off in the distance, having like a dragon come through that distance, like there's so many things you could do because it's, that blank horizon line, and instead like drifting off into this distance into like cool towers and stuff. Like, we made the most out of these locations because stuff could actually be seen in shapes. You could actually create like cinematic frames from the game engine. Like, I swear every update that they put, like, I only see it in context of making movies, and I was like, oh, look at all the distance we can do. So engine updates, draw distance, but the real change that happened then for Legion, like before, our production cycle starts before it's shipped to you guys, because like we're making that initial series of cinematics that are going into Legion. So we super expanded our team. We got programmers. Like, by the way, we've been doing all this stuff with like Chris Evans, who's like, yeah, I can kind of program, I'll make it work. Yeah, we got programmers, which was bananas. We got a programmer for Max. Do you know how hard it is to find a programmer who knows how to program tools in Max? It's dang impossible, because everybody's like, Maya has Python, and Python is like, C is great. Yeah, Max doesn't exist. We got the one. He's ours. You can't have him. We got a new rigging person, and I mean, we had a rigging guy, but he was slowly moving towards kind of like CG supervisor is the right role you would call it. So he's the guy that's like figuring out tech to make things happen. So he was moving away from rigging and into that. So we got a new rigging guy, but our rigging guy is bananas. Carlos Sancinetti, he like posts classes online all the time about how to rig and how to rig well. He is smart and amazing and easy to work with and just like wonderful to be like, what if we did this? What if we did this? Let's do this. And we got like a full team of animators. The animation department is half pre-rendered and half us. And it's because we're creating hours of content. Like, we're creating so many different movies and it's all keyframe animated, by the way. Like, there's nothing that's like auto-done except for like background characters, which is scripts, but like, we're animating everything. And also, like, one of the coolest parts about being an animator, let me toot my team's horn. One of the coolest parts about being an animator on my team is that it's not just these stoic moments staring off into the distance while the camera pans by you, like pre-rendered. Suck it, Seth. But it's it's like these amazing moments of like kick-ass fighting and like close-up zoom on a foot kick to dude's face to like emotional storytelling that you get to be with these characters and tell an entire movie and progress through like the change in leadership of an entire like group of people, like a kingdom changes their king or their warlord. Like just all of these moments that pre-rendered cinematics, they make the trailer to get you pumped and stoked for the expansion, and we tell the story behind the expansion. So our animators are like, oh my God, I get to have these characters act. I get to have them fight and struggle and feel. And so we needed a team, and they're the best talent animators in the world, and I get to work with them. It's effing amazing.
Windrunner, come forward.
War Chief.
The lower spirits say death will claim me soon. We are blessed to be in your presence once more, Zira.
Turalian, you have found the chosen one.
If I may offer a few words. It is with both pain and pride that we gather here today.
So I picked out my favorite scenes, and then there's a lot of scenes, but those are like my favorite ones. And I'm like, Antoine, a little bit of Vol'jin, perfect. So the modeling focus for Legion was different than every previous thing because I had on my team like a killer rigging guy. And we actually took and went through the entire pipeline and standardized rigging character topology. We made sort of like a GenMan character that we then iterated on every single possible character that we could, with the exception of, say, the Tauren, which is kind of extreme. But we made it so that every character had a topological face or hands or body or style that was expected by our rigging team and our animation team. And it suddenly streamlined rigging and animation really well. But it was conversations with Carlo that was actually really, really important, because he's like, oh, we're getting a really, really difficult time with our animation team getting the corner of the mouth to work right. And it's because the topology that we had been using had one too many spans in the corner. This is so technical, but we're going to get into that. It's like one too many spans here. How can we solve it? And I was like, oh, okay, if I change this span, like how to remove this while still providing the full character. We figured out a really solid GenMan that we used on elves and freaking everything. But it was like through these conversations, which were super valuable, that we standardized that. And standardizing something in a pipeline is the best thing, because it means that the rigging team, the animation team, isn't getting a special snowflake for every single character down the line, and they have to figure out everything brand new every single time. But rather, they're like, oh, I'm receiving something that I totally expect. I can apply this skin weight for the face on this character, and I can have what normally took me 3 days on just the face, I can have that done in 30 minutes, and then finesse it, per character. It completely changed, which meant that we could make way more characters, which means I had to work way faster. So that corner edge loop thingy was actually that vertice influence limit. The corner of the mouth, and the mouth in particular, has to perform so many minute expressions that it has to have just like the most mobility. And with that extra edge loop, it was so complicated that it was getting an influence from like 5 different bones, and that was one bone too many. So it was math. It was good. And because like those were very clear technological limitations, we had to make really creative workarounds to still enable our animators to create like world-class animation, but still inside these technical limitations. So it was kind of like a best practices update. We had a moment where he and I just talked about like, hey, what do we need? What are we gonna do? How can we do this better? And it was, we'd finish a cinematic and send the characters off into animation and lighting and rendering, and then we'd sit back and be like, hey, did that work well? What can we do better? And then we'd constantly be updating and fixing our best practices gen topology. And so yeah, Carlos Ancianetti, he has classes online. If you're interested in rigging, super recommend him. And also I was talking with like Hunter Grant, our animator. I'm like, is this working? Does this work for you? Like, just keeping that conversation alive. And turns out from animation, they're like, okay, so characters are really cool when they're delivered looking like their character selves. But what's even better is if you kind of make them look half-baked, in which is their eyelids are lowered really flat, but then the topology itself is flat, and that the mouth is perfectly flat. Now, as a modeler, I'm like, oh, but that doesn't look like the character. I'm like, no, but her eye shape is very specific. And they're like, no, we'll give you that, but you need to deliver this. And so it was like a learning experience for me to be like, all right, what does neutral look like? Suddenly, like, for all the orcs that are like, I had to like neutral them out, and they suddenly look like super peaceful orcs, which is unreal. But it's what animation needed, and I will do anything for my team. And God, to be honest, we're still making strides. Like, while I was prepping this class, I was showing my rigging and animation guys. I'm like, what do you think about this? I think this is actually going to work better. And I'm actually going to update my Gen Man with all this stuff. So, I mean, and when I get back, we're sitting with the pre-rendered character guy. We're sitting with our rigging guy, and we're going to just re-overhaul the Gen Man. We're going to make a Gen Man 3, which is kind of a standardized between pre-rendered and us, so that we can do some really cool stuff. But also, the rigging team has an easier time. All right, so that's all the World of Warcraft stuff, and we're like, yeah, we made a pipeline, we're doing really cool stuff, and then another game team came to us. I was like, hey, can you make a pipeline for us too? And we're like, oh, snap. So Overwatch. Overwatch is so freaking cool, but it's a whole new world, so we had to build an entire cinematic pipeline within another game engine. And this is another game engine that was built and made with no cinematics in mind. They didn't know they were going to do this. They didn't know they wanted this until they saw what we were doing for WoW. That speaks really highly of my team, because they impressed even like the Overwatch guys. So they're like, oh, cool, do it for us next. We had to make cinematic tools in the Overwatch engine, and that's like cameras, importing animation, controlling the lighting, because their lighting's baked. They've got kind of like global illumination. They don't have like a light that you put around the character to get mood. We had to figure out effects, timelines. Like, there's none of that, because it's a game. It's a game with cyclical animation that's triggered by certain controls that you guys control. It's not insert this camera and have the character act. We also had to figure out how to get the frames out of Overwatch, and we're still working on that, because it's a lot of work. And also, I had to, at least for myself, figure out exactly how to make those Overwatch characters, which perform really, really, really well in the game when you guys are controlling them. They look really freaking cool, but how to make them act, because my job, enabling my guys around me to make these characters act, is kind of daunting. And we made a Junkertown cinematic, and the pipeline didn't exist. It still kind of doesn't exist. We were laying down the tracks for getting stuff out of Overwatch engine while we were going, while they were still building the set for Junkertown. Like, all of this was simultaneous. It's a wild ride. But I'm going to show you a couple scenes from the Junkertown cinematic that I think are really cool, because it's the characters.
Well, that's a fine how do you do. What was it you think got us the boot? There's two things that solve every problem. Money and explosives. I've got an idea! Gunrun and Roadhog! Da 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 da.
I really hope you guys have all seen that cinematic, because it's Australia, but also because it's like, Overwatch is a serious property. I mean, it's a hopeful and positive property. These are the only characters that we could be so bananas with, because they're quite animated. That is who the characters are. So our animation team was like, Looney Tunes! Now, the modeling focus for me compared to World of Warcraft was vastly different, actually. I had to learn everything that there was to learn about Overwatch. Like, I basically had to become an Overwatch artist immediately, because, oh man, we created that cinematic in like 3 weeks. So I had to figure out how to become an Overwatch artist right then. And not just like an artist, I had to figure out how their shaders worked, how their baking works, all of this. because we needed to keep that Overwatch feel, but still allowing the characters to be seen in a way that you just don't see them in game. And it's like updating the characters to move and perform, but also these characters were doing stuff that the game never intended them to do. Like Junkrat has this cool scarecrow skin, and he has to like take his mask off. So it's like, well, what does his head look like under his mask? Because his body looks entirely like I had to figure out a lot of stuff on the fly, and I couldn't render anything in the engine because I didn't have that. So I was like, I think this is gonna work. So it was a lot of blind modeling based on knowledge of how stuff works. I'm like, oh, okay, I think this is gonna work. I completely changed the face to match our Genman topology because I'm biased. And there are things that I kept because that's a lot of work to get done in a couple days, but also spending a lot of time on the things that I felt mattered. And it was, for me, for Overwatch, it was all about the faces, making the faces work, and baking the faces so they looked stellar in-game. So it was very exciting, but it was a lot to learn, and it's like super intimidating because I'm like, what if I suck? But you work. So my day-to-day is kind of crazy. I'm working on a lot of World of Warcraft characters, Overwatch characters, a little bit of Diablo in there, every now and then HOTS, Heroes of the Storm. Hey, I call it HOTS. I'm like, I work on a lot of characters all of the time, but like it's kind of the same process for me for every character, at least fundamentally. I take the game characters. I'm like, give me that. And that's like my starting point. So it has to look better than this, and it has to work better than this. I rework the topology. Like I spend a lot of time making it work to perform. Game characters serve an entirely separate purpose than cinematic characters, and that's like the real difference. Not better or worse, it's just different. And then I work on the textures. That's a lot of like up-resing. I've got programs for that. And then like figuring out what's missing because things move and get revealed or have to change, or they're, the boss of all these dudes, so they have to look like the boss, but we don't have a boss in game, so I have to figure that stuff out. It's pretty sweet. That's my day-to-day work. Like I'm like, good to go. But the pipeline is amazing. And it's like really kind of broken down into pre-production, production, and post-production. So pre-production is the script and the storyboards and the concepts, and production is like animation getting it done. Really. And post-production is the lighting and compositing of things, and that's bringing in the lights, bringing in the tone and the mood, and cutting down like exactly what frames. It's our editing team and all that process. Now you'd think it's like, oh, where does modeling fit into that? Modeling is everywhere. So like I start when I'm given a cast of characters. I don't even have a script. Like when they had me kill Varian, or I didn't kill him. They killed Varian. I only knew that I had to make Varian. I didn't know in what context he was going to perform. I just knew who he was. So like I'm given a cast of characters, and I try to get that character stuff done ASAP. And I try to like kind of focus on what's needed when, so I deliver my meshes. And all throughout while animation is working, they're either working on temp meshes, because we've standardized our rigging topology pipeline. They can animate on a temp dude with the rig and then transfer that over to the final character because of that rig standardization. So I'm just delivering the whole time, like while they're working, and just injecting new characters into while they're animating everything. And once I finish delivering characters so that they can work, like I just want to make sure everybody is working. Our pipeline's truncated. Like we get stuff done between 3 and 6 weeks, and it's like an entire movie that's maybe 3 minutes long. It's a fast pipeline. So once I've delivered all the characters, then I go back and work on the things that are necessary. And so that polish happens all the way until I start seeing final frames. And when I see final frames, that's when I'm working on my textures, because that's how I'm seeing them in context. Like you wouldn't want to spend a whole bunch of time up-resing and polishing the texture of a boot if the boot was never seen. Or suddenly you find out that the bottom of the boot is seen, and you're like, oh, snap. I don't even have it's just black. And so you suddenly have to go back and sneak in some UVs and give a texture where it wasn't before. So, but luckily that's really independent of what our rigging team is doing. Like I can update my UVs and my textures and my materials without really impacting anybody else. So I just sneak that in at the end. So everything is constantly working, and I'm working the whole time. So what I do, I'm going to receive a model or concept from the game team. I'm going to evaluate it and kind of pull together all of my resources. I make a lot of characters. I wish I had counted. It's more than 50 a year. It's a lot of characters. I pull together everything, old characters that are kind of similar, and I mock up a temp character, and that's establishing the proportion and the overall look and feel of the character, and I immediately send that to rigging. They do a super fast, ugly rig for it, and animation starts. And then I model that, like I actually get the character done, and I model it and spend time on the performance topology, fidelity, screen performance. Like I kind of know what the character is doing by this point that I can give it something, and then it's textures. So I talked a little bit about how they're like itty bitty textures that I have to make big textures. Yeah, I hand paint a lot. I never hand painted before this team, but I do now, and I'm actually really enjoying it. Every now and then I'm like, oh, all I want to do is paint stuff. So let's talk about topology. This is kind of the like, this is my best practices, this is my best advice to you. I hope it's not scary, but when I look at topology, I get kind of geeky about it. I kind of look like this guy. Like, topology gets me that stoked. I know that it's kind of like the serious side of art because you're like, I'm making characters, I don't have to worry about topology. Like, technically you don't. Like, if you're making art, you're just making art. But if you're making production art, you have to make it work for everybody around you. So it is the, like, eat your vegetables, learn this shit topology. Topology is problem solving. The reason I like it is because it's like playing Sudoku in 3D. Like it's, I'm gonna figure this out if I put the 2 there, da, da, da. It's all like that. It's a puzzle. So it's a 3-dimensional puzzle. If you're doing it right, you're actually finding like a really simple and elegant solution. Topology can be fun if you're weird like me, but also like one thing to take away from this talk is this is what topology works for me. Your pipeline's probably different. There's a lot of different pipelines. Heck, there's like a Disney style of doing things and a Pixar style of doing things, and both are completely valid, but it depends on what team you're working with, what your rigging team wants, and what your animators want. So like, this is my advice, but it's not like, this is the way to do it. All right, the big rules that's true for everyone. Consistent edge flow. Keep your edges in parallel loops. Like, I'll see a model where the loop is actually spiraling down the arm. No, that's bananas, because it's gonna cause like render artifacting. So you wanna keep your loops just like running down the length of the arm, and also perfect little loop all the way up as needed based on the density that you need. And quads. I know that it's impossible to keep stuff all in quads, but please try. And if you have to have a triangle in it, hide it. Put it someplace that's just not getting a bunch of like animation. Like, try to do it smartly. You can honestly figure things out by like reconnecting edges around. You can get really creative and find good solutions for this stuff, but try to keep it in quads. It renders nicer. And avoid shearing. Now this is kind of like a complicated one to explain, so I'm gonna use my hands. All right, so quad, right? And if it is moving on a character, it should get smaller or longer or this way. So that way the texture itself and the quad itself is rendering well, but also the texture is kind of moving in a logical way. Shearing is when a quad is moving contrary to the motion and it squishes kind of like this. That squishing means that it tries to make, the renderer tries to make a triangle this way or this way, so it will like flicker between the two, or even so the quad will collapse. This is like super indicative on the cheek of a character, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but like avoid shearing, like understand the direction your movement is going and try to make sure that your quads are squishing proper. And then isolation. Isolation is a huge part of topology because you want to kind of separate one action from the other. It gives your animators more control, but it also means that, like, we've got a lot of Draenei characters that have like tentacles coming off their face. We want to isolate the animation of the tentacles from the rest of the character's face. And so there's just like a little edge loop around that, and that actually gives our rigging like exactly this loop is where the facial controls and rigs and bones end, and then that loop is where then the tentacle animation control begins. So it's like isolate, isolate. All right, so I'm gonna go through a couple like pieces of topology. Okay, I don't quad model, but I quad modeled for this specifically to be extremely clear with these are the lines that I'm making. Here's how you make that. So legs and arms, you want them all to be just a tube of topology running down, like really as expected. But the knee is specific because it's got this bony form protruding from it. So I did kind of like an inset or an extrude on the kneecap area that allowed me to sort of isolate that bony form and it preserves that shape when the character is bending the knee. Like by having that loop, it means that I'm always going to have a kneecap evident on my character's form, even as it's bending. So all you really need for a joint to bend is an edge loop at the joint. So you've got your skeleton and your joint right here, and all you need is an edge loop for it to do the bare minimum animation. But you're going to want supporting edge loops around your focal edge loop to preserve the volume as something is moving. So the leg will support that volume along with the two around it. So like every single joint, I have like a rule of threes when I'm talking and bringing on new people where I'm like, hey, topology, let's do this thing. Support. So it's one edge loop for control, two edge loops for support. And the knee joint is very specific. It doesn't exceed, the straightaway, and it bends in, and it only goes in one direction. So it really only needs this topology. Elbows and knees are kind of the same. So this is one of our orc dudes with his little knee and using kind of like an IK joint on his leg. Hi, Cookie. But now the knee only has to perform in that one way. It's a very simple joint. Of all the joints, the knee joint is the most simple. Elbows are a little bit different, and I had to move a piece of armor off this character, so this isn't perfect, but this is a production model. The elbow, because you've got that isolated bony form of the elbow, I want to be able to preserve that shape when it's bent here and when it's bent here. So I just take, after I make the tube that is my arm, I then take the polygons that are around the elbow, and then I just extrude in Maya or insert in Max just in one, and that creates like the isolation of the elbow bony form. So that way, if it's necessary for the performance of the character, you can always preserve that form, versus if it was a noodle, it would kind of get complicated at the elbow. Now, hands. This is the one that I recently just redid, and this is trying to make it as simple as possible with the edge flow. You start off with that inset, that isolation of the bony forms that are your knuckles. So I take that and bring that in with just an inset, but that also provides me with 3 edge loops around the webbing of the fingers so that I can preserve this shape as my character moves its hand like this or like this. Like, that's ideal. Isolating the bony form of the knuckle is ideal. And then I extrude out the fingers super simply, and then 3 edge loops at each knuckle. Like, that's the perfect number. That's all you need for knuckles. Though knuckles perform like knees, I'm not really going in super close up on the hands all that often. So this is all that's really needed for like a good knuckle. But pretend you were having a hand that was going to be what the entire animation was about. I might actually end up putting that kind of knee topology around each of those knuckles. So having kind of that isolated U to preserve that shape so that it looked even clearer on screen. But it's what works for you. This is what works for me. And actually, I did this hand, and this hand is going back in our Gen Man stuff as soon as I get back to the United States. But I had to solve the webbing of between the index finger and your thumb. We were getting a lot of triangles here, and the downside is that's an area of a lot of movement. But like our original solution and the solution that was used in production was kind of uncomfortable right in this area. So I wanted to make sure that I was keeping very consistent edge flow. And you'll see that there's an edge loop that runs all the way around here, and that actually allowed me to solve some really cool quads. And it's actually really important because I wanted to isolate the thumb. Your thumb movement in your animators needs to be isolated from the rest of your hand. So I actually just did a little inset inward, providing that edge loop of isolation, allowing me to preserve the topology for the thumb separate from everything else. So, like, this is as clear as I could make it, which is why it's like quad, quad, Zbrush, quad. And the thumb, like, when I had finished doing the quad modeling, I was like, wow, the thumb is facing the real wrong direction. So I loved my edge flow, but I just didn't like the orientation of the thumbnail end of things. So I just like took the top of the thumb, pulled it off, rotated it, and reattached it in the right direction. It still preserved my overall like clear edge flow, but it allowed me to have the orientation I needed. So clean edge loops, everything's gonna be a friend. This is an older hand. This isn't that hand in action. But this is a hand in production. This is Anduin, and it got like a super duper close-up. So that 3-joint edge loop over on his finger allows for the one edge loop for the finger to kind of indent in as the finger bends, and then the two edge loops supporting it, allowing for like the pads of the finger to kind of go out. So you get like a realistic looking finger as it moves, and it's just geometry. And it's not a heck of a lot of geometry, but it was enough to support the animation that we needed. So this is me using the rig. I'm no longer an animator, by the way. I can talk to animators, so this is like me just being like, oh, how does the hand move? And this is actually some of the first times that I've gotten to play with certain characters. It's pretty sweet. But I really like this hand everywhere except for the thumb. And I'm going to show you why. And this is because the thumb doesn't have the isolation along the palm. That line that your palm makes is a line because of how things move. This one doesn't even have that line. It does quads in a weird way, and it ends up collapsing and shearing right when the thumb is sort of rotated, and it's not my favorite thing. So see how it collapses? We have a close-up of his hand, and if that collapses, it kind of renders odd and not as expected, so that's why I needed to have like a better solution that I could put into the game. So the hand to the arm, you know, I made an extra edge loop at the wrist so that it could really easily extend into the noodle topology of your overall arm. Wrists rotate all around. There's no fancy schmancy topology for a wrist. It just has to be like clear lines running down so that it can bend every which direction. It's a unique joint, a lot like a shoulder actually, so it has to move a lot of ways. And I removed a bracer off of his arm. You don't even see these polys, which is why there's like, wow, that's really mechanical. But because I have all these concentric loops leading up the arm, the rigging guys can be like, this joint affects exactly to here and no further. And it ends up making their life really, really simple. Had it been a spiral up the arm, they'd have to get kind of fancy with, oh, I guess this joint affects to maybe here-ish, and it'll get real muddy real quick. So reusable topo. You have to understand anatomy and body mechanics. A lot of topology can be used again and again and again. And there's a lot of relationships between our humanoid topology and the topology of crazy pants things that we make for World of Warcraft. Like wings. I really love Kil'jaeden because of his wings, and I got to sit down with my animators specifically about how wings work. And it was really actually exciting. He's like, yeah, they're actually hands. And I was like, they're what? Wings are arms and hands, just in a really weird way. So you can actually find all of the similarities, right? Like, so the shoulder is the shoulder, obviously, in your elbow and stuff, but all of the little spines in a bat wing are actually his hands. And we had to change the art for a lot of these winged characters to match the number of joints that are in fingers, and it ended up creating wings that worked really, really super well. So they're arms, they're knuckles, and if you think of it that way, your solution for topology will be really simple. And this sort of same idea was applied to these angel wings. I wish the animators had let me play with the angel wings before I delivered the final model, because like as I was playing with this, I was like, we need way more feathers. This is just, bleh. But they move like arms. So when animators are animating wings, they're animating them as their arm would move. The shoulder joint goes all the way around, the elbow only goes one way, and the wrist goes all around. So the way it flies is like that. Now this has kind of like the finger joints along the feathers, but since feathers don't, like that, it's just used to kind of control the shape of the wing as it's pushing wind or whatnot. So it's just to make it believable. So it's the same rig, but vastly different purposes. Shoulder. Now this is one of the things that I just had to rework and I'm about to put into the pipeline. And this is just like super, super clear. I want these edges going this way. Another solution for shoulder topology is to isolate the deltoid. My animators don't prefer that. They would rather represent the anatomical changes as you lift your arm manually through rigs and controls, while having the freedom to rotate the arm completely independent of anatomy however they want. So it's noodle, but the secret to our anatomy in the shoulder is actually the back. We have to isolate the shoulder blade. Because of that, I had to figure out where I was putting those loops. In this particular model, which I'm going to pitch to the guys, the loop that isolates the scapula, then goes down into the elbow and stops there, because I was starting to get a whole lot of like edge loops running down the arm, and it exceeds the amount that I need leading into the hand. So isolating the scapula allows you to sculpt specifically the shape of the back as you bring your arms back in together, which would give us shadows in rendering and a lot more of like really cool stuff, because like we'll have characters that'll be like, wah! And you want the shoulders to like meet together and pinch, because you'll see that in the clothes they're wearing, in the texture and all of that. So I said there was like some ZBrush magic. I only managed to pull out a time lapse of one of these things. So if you wanted to sculpt a character with proper topology, it's really not that scary. Just like model your box, take it into ZBrush, and just kind of like noodle stuff around. This is actually really helpful for me because I can spread the polys around and know where I need further density to support like an overall shape. So I'm working super, super fast, but what I'm looking for is the areas where I don't have enough, or I know that it's not going to support the topology, so that I can take it back out and add an extra edge loop, which I ended up doing around the clavicle for this one. And I think, yeah, so you'll see me like actually figuring out the anatomy, and then just, I'm only exporting the low, but I want it to be believable anatomy. Facial topology, probably, okay, I have 3 minutes to go through facial topology. Huh. Okay, so the edge flow is super, super important, but it's all about isolation in faces. Now, with faces, you want to isolate the entire face, because you're limiting your facial animation to just this. So there's an edge loop that goes all the way around. Then you've got the muzzle of your mouth, right? You've got your mouth itself, the isolation around the nose, and the isolation around the eyes. And what is unique to our pipeline, at least, because we've got orcs and trolls with massive, heavy brows, we actually isolate the brow, because we want to be able to move these really large forms, but without them interfering with the actual animation of the eyeballs. So, face isolation, super, super important. And all of this actually ends up with like really, really clear topological flow, which allows the fall-off distances for rigs and controls to be very clear. Like, why do we isolate the brows? Because these guys with their Cro-Magnon foreheads, this is me animating with it, and I'm like, wow, that's the coolest. I never get to animate anymore. I love it. It's really cool. I think I'm going to ask for an animation thing when I get back, just so I can know even more about what we're creating. But we isolate those brows so that we can take these super dense and heavy eyebrows and perform even better with them. Mouth isolation. Mouths are super important. There's some really, really great talks from rigging teams and tech artists on the internet, but the spans and the places where you decide to have your edge flow lead to are really, really critical. And this is actually the difference between a Pixar face and a Disney face. Disney faces will have the edge loop from the eyeball meet underneath the nose, and a Pixar face, which I like, goes down into the mouth. And I prefer one over the other, but that's not to say that one is worse or better. It's just what I do. So this is from the eyes into the mouth, but concentric circles around the mouth. We like having a double circle around the edge of the lip to allow for rendering to be super, super crisp. And then the edge loops that lead across, like lengthwise along the mouth, they all meet in a perfect point in the middle. They have to actually line up, because for our animation team, they want it to have a perfect lip seal, but also they want their controls to be just so. And it makes them sound a little bit picky, but if you have the mouth be super, super flat with all the edge loops lining up as needed, the performance and the shapes that they can create aren't impacted by a stylized little like Cupid's bow of a mouth, and then they're not fighting against the geometry of that to create all of the the shapes that your mouth makes when it says different sounds. Whatever, I forgot the word. But the span number is very specific. We have one additional control in our standard rig because we're dealing with characters that have tusks in their mouths. So our edge flow is just one additional over the Pixar stuff, but it allows us for more versatility within our pipeline. So you've got your control points. This is where the animation control lines up. So we've got an animation control in the middle, an animation control just outside the point, one along the edge, and then one at the corner of the mouth. And then the additional edge loops all maintain a really pleasing shape. So it's all about control and shape. So as I lift up Tyralion's lip, there's the place where I'm lifting it up and then there's one edge loop that controls the control, and then no further. That control only is responsible for these 3 lines, and just the same with the bottom of his lip. So it's very specific control to allow the artists that are animators create artistically pleasing animation shapes. Now, you know how I mentioned shearing? The side of your jaw is actually where shearing is most common. We keep an edge loop that runs perfectly parallel straight back from the edge of the lip to the corner of the jaw, because as you open your mouth, your skin stretches this way and this way. So our edge flow is super specific. Like, I dead serious grab that edge loop and I just scale it in Z so it's perfectly flat. And then everything else is just slightly skewed to then flow into the rest of it. But it creates like a perfect quad that deforms really nicely. But actually, it also performs really anatomically when you're pulling the corner of the lip back. You're creating folds and shapes within the character that are natural to your face as you pull your own lips back. So it's performing as expected without deforming the textures at all. It's perfect. Eyes are just like mouths, honestly. You want your edge loops to line up along the eyelid because the eyelids have to close. All of your characters are going to be just super half-lidded, so that way you've got texture and UV support for the eyelid itself so that it can be fully closed and fully opened satisfyingly. And you can kind of see that in action. When it closes, all those edge loops meet perfectly, which means that everything is going to work as intended, and the more animations you layer on top of it, the better results you're going to get. Now, my facial topology gets kind of wild. I have to work on creatures of all kinds, dinosaurs, werewolves, all of that. So the werewolf, the big secret and difference between the topology of a human face and a werewolf face is that muzzle isolation. I take that muzzle isolation and add a bunch of edge loops between it and the next edge loop, and that's where I'm pulling out the rest of his jaw. Now I have to finesse it as needed. Very specifically, his snaggle teeth were really hard to resolve. I had to maintain a level of no intersection, but also allow for the character to perform. But additionally, beyond that, this character has to perform in a way that is inhuman. So there are some rigs that don't actually exist, like this, like a snarl, and then his like mouth like getting, I don't know about that, but also like his head, like that doesn't exist in humans, but it will for werewolves. So it's fun to get creative with fantasy sorts of characters. So the conversations that help me the most is I talk with my director, I talk with my animators, I talk with my rigging. I'm like, hey, what do you need? What do you need from me? How is this guy even performing? And I want to hear about from the animators, like, what are you envisioning when you see this script? Like, is this guy going to be like a kung fu ninja? I don't know. So I'm always trying to save time. Like, those conversations allow me to be like, well, this is an elf. Well, I have an elf from forever ago, which means that I have to get stuff done really nicely right once so that I can just grab it for every single further time. Like, I spent a lot of time on trolls recently just so I could like have a really good principal troll that rigging always was expecting, and then morph it to whatever character I was working on. So some good questions, if you've never talked to an animator before, is like, are we having an emotional performance for this character? Are they yelling? Like, are they yelling so much I'm seeing inside of their mouth? Because I need to know that. Are we getting super close up? But from what angle? Like, what do you think is going to happen? And expressive, like, do I need to isolate those eyebrows because of brooding? Is it an action sequence? Like, how much do I need to make sure that the limbs perform or the armor around the limbs perform? Or is it a background character? Oh, you say it's a background character, but are we getting super close up? Because I might just do textures and no modeling on a background character. Is it performing even at all? Do I just need to support some kick-assery, but not, you know, like facial expressions? Or does that background character only just frown? So I sort of like limit the work that I do based on the needs because I have to work fast. So I'm like, every shortcut possible. But that's what I do. I cannot wait to see what you guys do, and I hope you do a lot of it. But thank you very much.